The sun had just dipped behind the White House, casting long shadows across the lawn when something happened no one expected. Not the aides, not the generals, and certainly not Karoline Leavitt. Amid a high-powered dinner filled with sharp suits, sharper egos, and world-shaping conversations, it wasn't a policy or scandal that stole the room's attention. It was the quiet, trembling voice of a child. Elon Musk's young son, standing alone near the south portico, eyes filled with tears, spoke words that froze Caroline in her tracks. And what he said next sent chills through everyone within earshot. Before we unfold this powerful story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss stories that matter. It was past 9 p.m. in Washington, D.C., and most of the West Wing was winding down. The ornate corridors that once echoed with footsteps and fast-talk briefings had gone quiet, like a church after the last hymn. The chandeliers overhead flickered gently, casting long shadows down the marbled hallways. Outside, the White House garden lay bathed in the soft amber glow of antique lanterns, the air cool with a faint trace of fall. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in U.S. history, was supposed to be heading home. Her briefcase was packed, her aide had already left, and the Secret Service team had given her the customary nod. But instead of walking out the front like everyone else, she lingered. Something about that evening hadn't sat right. The state dinner had been high profile, a round table of America's tech giants, foreign advisors, military strategists, and federal watchdogs. Elon Musk had attended, of course, seated toward the center of the table, animated as always, bouncing between visions of Mars colonies and new encrypted defense satellites. People listened when Elon talked. Whether they agreed or not, they listened. But what Caroline couldn't shake, what stayed with her like the soft pressure of a hand on her shoulder, wasn't what Elon said. It was what his son did, just 6 years old. Everyone called him X for short. He'd sat beside his father the entire evening, a small child dwarfed by power suits, wine glasses, and words like biometric interface and geopolitical deterrence. He didn't interrupt, didn't play on a tablet, didn't whine. Instead, he'd folded a napkin into the shape of a bird, quietly, delicately, like it was the most important thing in the room. And when there was a pause in conversation, just after a general had made some heated point about international threats, X had spoken. His voice was soft, uncertain, but unmissable. What happens when people disappear? The words hung in the air like smoke. For a full 5 seconds, the room froze. It wasn't just the gravity of the question, it was the contrast. In a place obsessed with power, strategy, and status, here was a boy asking something that no one could quantify. Elon didn't answer. None of them did. They smiled politely, shifted in their seats, chuckled awkwardly, and then the conversation moved on. But Caroline noticed the boy's face, how his shoulders slumped, how he gripped the napkin bird tighter, how he went silent, not because he'd run out of things to say, but because the grown-ups had taught him something in that moment, that some questions make adults uncomfortable, that sometimes silence is louder than answers. She'd been in meetings where presidents lost their temper. She'd sat across from reporters trying to corner her with questions. But none of those moments stayed with her the way this one did. So instead of going home, Caroline had wandered back down the garden path, her heels crunching against the gravel, her steps slow. She didn't expect to see him again, but as she turned the corner near the old maple tree, there he was, a small figure sitting on the iron bench, curled up like a comma in the sentence of history, alone, crying. She paused, heart tightening. For a long moment she didn't speak. She just watched him, this boy born into genius and fame, folded over himself like every child who's ever felt too small to matter in a room full of adults. Then gently she approached. "Hey, X," she said, her voice barely above the breeze. You okay? He didn't look up, just sniffled, rubbed his eyes, and nodded. The paper bird lay beside him now, limp and crumpled, as if it had lost its wings somewhere between dinner and the garden. Karoline lowered herself onto the bench slowly, careful not to startle him. She sat at the other end, giving him space. It was the same bench she used to sit on years ago, when she was just a staffer, when she used to sneak out with a cup of bad coffee and stare at the stars, wondering how a small-town girl from New Hampshire ended up in the orbit of power. "You snuck out too, huh?" she offered, trying a soft smile. The boy nodded again, still silent. She waited. Sometimes silence isn't empty. It's just sacred. It holds space for the unsaid. And Karoline had learned, through years of press briefings, public service, and personal loss, that sometimes the most important thing an adult can do is simply be present. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't mean to ask a bad question." Her heart caught in her throat. "You didn't," she said gently. "It was a brave question." X looked up, eyes red but curious. "Then why did everyone get quiet?" Karoline sighed. The question was as old as time. Why do people look away when faced with something real? "Because sometimes," she said, "grown-ups are afraid of questions they don't know how to answer." He blinked. "But they're grown-ups. Aren't they supposed to know everything?" Karoline smiled, sad but true. "I used to think so too. But getting older doesn't always make you wiser. Sometimes it just makes you quieter." He looked down at the bird. "I think I broke it," he mumbled. She leaned slightly forward. "You know what I think?" He shook his head. "I think it's still a bird, even if it's not flying right now." A long pause. Then X asked the question again, but differently this time. What if people disappear and no one remembers them? This wasn't a question about biology. It wasn't even really about death. It was about love, about memory, about fear. And Karoline suddenly saw not a tech mogul's son, but a little boy who had more in common with her than she realized. Because deep down, hadn't she wondered the same? After her grandmother passed, Karoline couldn't remember her voice for years. She felt guilty, afraid that memory was fading. That love could fade too. She placed her hands in her lap. "Do you know what I believe?" she asked softly. X looked up. "I believe love stays, even when people leave, even if their voice gets quiet in your memory, even if you forget their favorite color or the way they laughed. The love doesn't leave." The boy didn't say anything, but his breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed just a little. Karoline glanced up at the sky, where the stars blinked faintly through the light pollution of the capital. She remembered her grandma saying once, "We don't stop loving people just because we can't see them anymore." Now she understood what that meant. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves. Somewhere inside the building, a phone rang. Somewhere beyond the gate, a journalist barked a question into a microphone. But on that bench, under the West Garden maple, none of that mattered. Just a child, a question, and a grown-up who didn't flinch when the world got too honest. And maybe that was the whole point. The following morning began like most do at the White House. Too early, too fast, and filled with the hum of agendas, updates, and urgent emails that waited for no one. Karoline Leavitt had slept little, not because of briefing prep, not because of the usual political firestorms lighting up the news cycle, but because of a question, not one hurled from a reporter, not one prepped by a strategist. A question from a child. What if people disappear and no one remembers them? It had been over 12 hours since the boy Elon Musk's son asked it, and still it sat in her chest like a stone on calm water. Not loud, just unmovable. She sat at her desk, eyes drifting from the official press memos to the window, where the West Garden now shimmered in the morning light. A few birds chirped near the trimmed hedges. The bench under the maple was empty, but in her mind, it wasn't. She still saw him there, small, fragile, fidgeting with a folded napkin bird that no longer flew. The night before had ended quietly. After their conversation, Karoline walked him back inside. No one had noticed he was gone. Elon was deep in discussion with a defense official. Aides buzzed around the room. One of them gently reached out and took X's hand. He didn't say goodbye. He just glanced over his shoulder as they walked away, giving Karoline a half nod, the kind you only give to someone who really listened. Back in her residence, Karoline had stood at her sink brushing her teeth and heard her grandmother's voice in her mind again. Some questions don't need answers, sweetheart. They need someone who doesn't walk away. Her grandmother had passed when Karoline was 19, but some words outlive the body. They become bones in your heart, structure, memory. Now, in the cold clarity of the morning, Karoline faced a decision. Most days she would have buried the feeling, thrown herself into work, pivoted toward control. She was, after all, a press secretary in the most powerful building in the world. But this day felt different, so she picked up her office phone. "Get me Elon Musk," she said calmly to her assistant. A pause on the line. "Sir, he's scheduled for a closed tech briefing with Homeland Security this afternoon." Karoline nodded. "When it's over, tell him I'd like to speak. Just him. Alone." "Yes, ma'am." She hung up and waited. It wasn't until just after 3 p.m. that Elon entered her office. The door clicked shut behind him, and Karoline saw him for what he was beyond the Twitter headlines and SpaceX myths. A father, tired, carrying 1,000 tabs open in his brain. He looked confused at first, maybe expecting a discussion on quantum satellite contracts, or maybe he feared she'd criticize his comments at dinner. Instead, Karoline gestured to the chair across from hers. "Something happened last night," she said gently. Elon raised an eyebrow. "Your son," she continued. "He asked a question." Elon's gaze narrowed slightly, now more focused. "I remember," he said. "Something about death?" Karoline nodded. "Yes." He asked, "What happens when people disappear?" Elon shifted in his seat. "He's a deep thinker. Always has been." "Did you hear what happened after?" He tilted his head. "Nothing," she said softly. "No one said a word. They moved on, pretended he hadn't asked." Elon's brow furrowed, but his shoulders stayed stiff. "I didn't know what to say," he replied. "What do you say to a 6-year-old asking about mortality?" Karoline leaned forward slightly. "You say something, anything, or at least you sit with him in the silence." Elon blinked. It was rare for anyone to speak to him like this. "I'm not criticizing," she added gently. "I've done the same thing. I've sidestepped hard questions with clever lines and polite nods. But last night," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I watched a little boy look around a room of adults and learn that truth makes people uncomfortable, that when you ask about things that matter, people go quiet." Elon exhaled through his nose. "I didn't mean for that." "I know," she said, "but intent doesn't protect a child from the echo of being ignored." He looked down at his hands. For once, the world's loudest innovator had nothing to say. Karoline rose from her chair and walked to the window, where the afternoon light was beginning to fade into the orange tones of early evening. "You know," she said quietly, her back still turned, "your son told me something." Elon looked up. He said, "What if the people who are gone forget me?" A long silence followed, not a silence of indifference, a silence of gravity. Elon stood up slowly, his hands sliding into his pockets. "I didn't know he was carrying that," he muttered. "He is," she said, "and he's carrying it quietly." Karoline turned to face him. "He doesn't need the answer to be perfect, Mr. Musk. He just needs someone to meet him there, in the ache, in the fear, and say, 'You're not alone.'" Elon nodded, his jaw clenched slightly. Not in defense, but in the silent admission that somewhere along the way, he'd missed that moment. Then he asked, "What did you say to him?" Karoline smiled, but there was sorrow in her eyes. "I told him that love doesn't leave, that when people go, their love stays like light from a star that already burned out. It keeps going, even if we don't see it." Elon looked down at the floor, then back up. "That sounds like something a kid might understand better than I do." Karoline chuckled, but it wasn't lighthearted. It was bittersweet. "Sometimes they do," she said. "Sometimes we spend so long trying to sound smart, we forget that truth can be simple." A few minutes later, Elon left. No grand statements, no promises. Just a nod, a pause, and the quiet walk of a man reconsidering something he thought he'd buried under meetings and missions. Karoline stood in her office a while longer, the paper bird now sitting on her windowsill, crumpled but still intact. That night she didn't draft memos. She pulled out a small leather journal she hadn't opened in months and wrote one sentence. "Sometimes the most dangerous silence is the one we teach a child to expect." That evening, long after the meetings had ended and the West Wing had dimmed to soft lamplight, Karoline Leavitt stood by her window again. Below, the West Garden was still, untouched, sacred. But something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just the boy's question that lingered. It was the echo of it, a hollow note bouncing around in her own soul. What if they forget I love them? Karoline had spent her life answering questions with precision. As a White House press secretary, clarity was currency. But there were questions she hadn't asked in years, maybe out of fear, maybe out of pride. She walked across the quiet corridor, not toward the conference room, but toward her private den. It was the only place in the building that felt less like the job and more like herself. There, on a small table beneath an American flag and a dusty Bible, sat a framed photo of her mother. And behind that, hidden from daily view, was one of her grandmother. The woman who raised her when her father was always working and her mother was trying to hold everything together. Her grandmother's hands were always busy, kneading dough, stitching fabric, or holding a child too tired to understand the world. Karoline whispered aloud, "When did I stop asking you things?" The silence in the room pressed in gently. She remembered being 12, sitting on her grandma's porch in Atkinson, New Hampshire, watching the fireflies drift like floating candles through the dusk. "What happens when people die?" she had asked once. Her grandmother had smiled, not with answers, but with presence. "They're in the little things we keep," she'd said, patting the lace handkerchief in her apron pocket. "You'll know they're close when your heart softens." Karoline had dismissed that as childlike sentiment. Until now. Now she stood in the White House, years older, globally recognized, confident, calculated, yet feeling more child than leader. She pulled open a drawer and reached for her phone. "Mom." The last text had been days ago. Politics, logistics, nothing real. Her thumbs hovered, then typed, "Mom, can I call you tomorrow? I want to hear the story about Grandma again." She hit send, exhaled, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. She felt reconnected. The boy hadn't just asked a question about death. He'd unlocked something more sacred, the need to be remembered, the fear of being erased, and in doing so, he helped Karoline remember where her own roots began. 2 days later, Elon Musk returned to the White House for a scheduled security briefing, and this time, X came with him. Karoline spotted him near the hallway fountains, trailing a step behind his father, his small hands clasped around something folded. She caught his eye and smiled. Elon noticed, leaned down to X and whispered, "Would you like to stay with Miss Karoline for a bit while I'm in the meeting?" X nodded without hesitation. Karoline held out her hand. "Want to visit our bench again?" The boy grinned and followed her without a word. They walked out into the west garden. The maple leaves had started to gold. The breeze was soft. Autumn had officially arrived. They sat on the same bench, Karoline on the left, X on the right, just like before. Only this time, the boy wasn't curled into himself. He was holding a new bird, folded from a napkin again. This one wasn't crumpled. I made it better, he said, placing it on her lap. Karoline smiled, her heart tugging. It's beautiful, she whispered. They sat in silence for a bit, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was familiar. Then he looked up. Do you still believe what you said? She turned to him. About the stars? He nodded. I do, she said. Even more now. The boy looked down at his hands. I asked my dad again last night. Karoline raised an eyebrow gently. What did he say? He didn't laugh, X said. He didn't change the subject. He just sat down. And he said, I don't know, buddy, but I think it matters that you're asking. Karoline blinked. Her eyes stung. Do you know what that means? She asked. X nodded slowly. That I'm not weird for wondering. She smiled. That you're wise. They stayed a little longer. Karoline told him stories of her grandma, of baking bread in the fall, of chasing squirrels with a wooden spoon, of the way her grandmother would always whisper, don't be in such a rush to grow up. Adults forget things that children know by heart. X laughed. Like what? Like how to sit still, how to ask things that make people uncomfortable, how to cry when it hurts without pretending it doesn't. X went quiet again. Then he said something that shattered her. Sometimes I cry when I don't even know why. She looked at him. That's okay, she said. Sometimes even grown-ups do. They just hide it better. Suddenly he turned and hugged her. Tight, not childish, not clumsy, just honest. Thank you for not being scared, he whispered. Karoline froze, then slowly placed her hand on his back. Thank you, she replied, for being brave enough to ask. From a distance, an aide called softly. Miss Leavitt, Mr. Musk is ready. Karoline nodded. X stood up, then looked at her again. I think questions are like keys, he said quietly. She tilted her head. They unlock something in people, even if they don't answer. She was stunned. A 6-year-old philosopher. She smiled, heart swelling. Then keep asking, X, she said, because grown-ups, we forget where we left the keys. As he walked away, small shoes crunching leaves, Karoline remained seated, watching, remembering, feeling. She thought of her grandma, her mother, herself, and how this boy had reminded her that it's not always about solving the mystery. Sometimes it's just about being the person who doesn't walk away from the question. That evening, long after Elon Musk and his son had left the White House, Karoline returned to her office. But she didn't head straight for the desk. She bypassed the folders, the press schedule, and the stack of policy memos. Instead, she opened the drawer where she kept personal things, notes from citizens, old Bible verses, hand-drawn cards from school children who admired her. And now, she placed something new there, a folded paper bird, not crumpled, not broken, still, gentle, unspoken. She closed the drawer slowly, like sealing a sacred truth, because it wasn't just a memento, it was a reminder. She didn't speak for the rest of the night. No calls, no interviews, no headlines, just stillness and memory. And as the lights of DC glittered like reflections of forgotten prayers, Karoline sat on her balcony, wrapped in a shawl her mother had knitted for her years ago. She thought about how power is measured in statements, in ratings, in viral clips, or in something smaller. Like the way a child chooses you to hold a question they're afraid to carry alone. That, she realized, was the truest form of trust. And in the silence of that night, Karoline whispered to herself something she hadn't said aloud in years. I don't have all the answers, but I can listen, and I can stay. The next morning, the press room was full again. Reporters jostled for attention. Lights beamed down. The hum of politics resumed its steady march. But something about Karoline was different. She paused more, smiled slower, listened longer, and when someone asked a snide question, she didn't deflect with wit or spin. She answered with grace, or sometimes didn't answer at all because she'd remembered something vital. Not every question is asked to be solved. Some are asked to see if you're human. Later that week, a small moment went viral. No press team had planned it. No crew had staged it. A staffer had quietly taken a photo from the hallway. Karoline Leavitt kneeling beside a child in the West Garden, his tiny hand resting on her shoulder. Her eyes level with his, the paper bird between them. There was no caption, but none was needed. The image was shared thousands of times, on veterans groups, on church forums, on grandparents' Facebook pages, on parenting blogs. It wasn't just the photo, it was what it represented, a truth far too rare in today's world. Presence is power, and love doesn't need a podium. A week later, Karoline did something unexpected. She took a morning off. No suit, no media, just a worn sweater and a quiet car ride to her hometown. She asked the driver to stop at a place she hadn't visited in over a decade. A small, weathered house, white trim, green door, cracked porch steps. Her grandmother's house. It was abandoned now, the yard overgrown, the paint chipped. But as she stood there, she could almost hear the laughter, the screen door slamming, the smell of baked apples, the hum of a sewing machine. She sat on the front step, closed her eyes, and let the memories in. Not to cry, but to listen, because some memories don't speak until you're finally still enough to hear them. A rustle caught her attention. An elderly woman was walking down the path with a cane, eyes squinting. She stopped at the gate. Karoline. Karoline turned, startled. Yes? The woman smiled. I taught you in Sunday school. You asked too many questions. Karoline laughed softly. Still do. The woman nodded. Good. The world needs fewer people with answers and more people willing to ask better questions. They talked for a while about faith, about her grandmother, about life after loss. And before Karoline left, the woman said something she'd never forget. You want to be remembered, child. Don't be loud. Be honest. Be there. When someone hurts, just be the one who stays. Karoline hugged her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a press secretary. She felt like a granddaughter, a daughter, a woman, a soul, rooted again. She returned to the White House with something new in her heart. Not confidence, not power, but clarity. And one afternoon, during a walk through the garden, she saw a familiar figure again. X, trailing behind Elon, paused by the maple tree. He turned and ran to her without a word. Just hugged her, tight. Karoline crouched, embraced him, and whispered, Still asking big questions? X nodded. Always, she smiled. That's what makes you strong. He looked up. Even if I don't get answers. Karoline held his face in her hands, especially then. That night she opened a fresh page in her personal notebook. Not a speech, not a policy draft, just a quiet entry that read, Sometimes the one who asks the question changes the room more than the one who answers it. She placed the paper bird beside the notebook, closed both, and finally, let herself breathe. And now, if you're still watching this, have you ever heard a question that stopped you in your tracks? Tell us in the comments. What's one question you still carry today? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who once held space for your truth. And if you believe in the power of presence, of memory, and of listening when it matters most, Subscribe for more real stories that remind us what truly lasts. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.